This was wonderful. Thank you all for your amazing presentations. Some of us, I think, shed some tears during some of certain moments here. It seems to be a pattern since the first session when Linda directed us.
Presentation and performance.
Yeah, and the performances, exactly. We're very privileged on this panel to have also people so talented performing here, both in the academic sense and in the artistic senses of the word. Okay, so why don't we just simply start with having questions? Okay, I'll start from this way, yeah.
Can I first congratulate you for selecting such an excellent panel? First to Dafna, I would say that was really a great presentation. I just wanted to ask about the question of the intro. Saleh Al-Kuwaiti brought in the intro to the music. What was happening before? Does the song start straight away? There's no introduction whatsoever? They just start? That's one thing. The other thing that I have found looking for names of writers of these songs is that, because they're never mentioned normally, that Abdul Karim Al-Allaf probably did most of the songs of Saleh Al-Kuwaiti, but I discovered that Saleh Al-Kuwaiti composed some himself, or wrote some of the poetry himself, which I suppose over time he got to know the words. The other question I would like to ask Yaron, you talk about Iraqi nostalgia and Iraqi Jewish past. I wonder whether you didn't mention, I expected you to mention, but you didn't, the film The Dove Flyer. And I wonder whether you have got any views on that at all. Thank you very much.
Okay, do you want to respond?
Yeah. From the recordings we have before Saleh Al-Kuwaiti songs, we can hear sometimes a very short phrase played by the instruments, and this phrase is taken from the melody of the song, and then the song starts. Often it's one melody, so there is no verse and refrain, it's just one melody for all the verses. But what we hear in Saleh Al-Kuwaiti songs is a more elaborate intro. Sometimes it is in the melody of the song, but it's a bit longer, and we can notice his awareness of the instrumentation. But as I said, sometimes it's also a completely different intro in a different melody. It's often a sequence, which was new in Iraqi music at the time. Like if you go, ta-na-na-na-na, 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 that's what I mean by sequence. So that was new. As for the lyrics, we know that Saleh Al-Kuwaiti himself wrote some of the lyrics. We know that Abdul Karim Al-Allaf wrote many of the lyrics, but we don't have much documentation, and it's really hard to tell for sure who wrote the lyrics for each song. This is connected to the larger issue of credits at the time. So for many of Saleh Al-Kuwaiti's songs, we're not even sure if he composed them, and there are arguments around that. So that's a very tricky question, the whole question of authorship, both the lyrics and the music.
And Emil, I'm almost tempted to give you the answer that you gave after your presentation. There's only that much you can cover. I can use it again. No. But actually, at some point, I did have a note about that, and I need just to say something very brief. In general, in my work on Mizrahi cinema and other, I do not define films by the filmmaker's identity. So it's by subject matter, yeah? I define Mizrahi by subject matter, not if somebody is Mizrahi or not, but really specifically for only this specific thing. I am talking about people whose parents are Iraqi. I know Nissim Dayan very well. He was one of my first film professors at Tel Aviv University. I worked with him. He made Michel Ezra Safra Vanav, and that would be second generation Syrian, but not Iraqi. Nissim Dayan is not an Iraqi subject matter. Yeah, it has to do with Iraq. Eli Amir, first generation, yeah.
Go ahead.
First, I second Amir about
So, yeah.
I second Amir about the excellent choice of the people here and the entertaining side of what they've explained to us. What I wanted to say to Yaron, that not only the people of 1950 blocked Iraq, we who actually 20 years later also blocked Iraq, and 1991 was a kind of an eye-opener or thinking about it and then realizing how limited our movement in Iraq was, only those few kilometers that actually we were moving in Baghdad, but we thought that it's the whole world. And then 2003 was another point when, with the fall of Saddam, it triggered other people to, like, for example, Linda mentioned about it. And I cannot quote exactly, but what in the 1991, Sami Michael saying basically, it's a very strange feeling that my country is attacking my country.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing. Now, when it comes to the Dove Flyer, I saw it twice. The first time I was so angry because it's really, there were a lot of things were not correct. Like Ben Gurion, and they put a beard on him. Nuri Said wasn't like this. And the Muslim accent, for God's sake, this is a Palestinian accent. The second time when we had a show for the family in a private cinema, I mellowed down and I said, maybe this is a film. Just the idea was to present things. So this is a very, very important that this nostalgia is really relative, and the way you present the country and how you see it, it depends on your own experience.
Yeah. And if I may just
Please go
add, saw Nissim Dayan just before the premiere of his film, and before he couldn't distribute the film for a long time, the filmmaker of this film, and Haim Shiran was there at that time. I mean, another filmmaker, somebody fairly well known more about Moroccan traditions, Moroccan Jewish traditions anyways. And he told him, they are good friends, he told him, you know, Nissim, nobody's going to show this film. Are you crazy? It's all in Arabic. It's the first, for anyone who doesn't know that, it's the first Israeli, not film ever to have all Arabic in it.
Yeah.
Feature film. Feature film, obviously, feature film that has all.
Yeah, but it was like Nuri Said was speaking in a Palestinian accent with a beard.
Yeah, yeah.
So for us, for those characters which are historical character, it was kind of like, you know.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes, go ahead.
I'm not ashamed to repeat, this was moving and wonderful. All four presentations had a lot to do with media and mediation. And even when they led back to family context, the question of mediation and the use of new media such as recordings in the transformation of music was central. But my question is about family. When it comes to embodied practices and to music, it's very much about kin groups, about informal connections that are patterned, not necessarily mother, daughter, father, son. We don't do this now in family history. So I would like just to pose a question for all four of you, but especially to the three of you dealing with music, about the role of kin and family connections in shaping all of this. Also as a mode of survival and of transmission nowadays, but also in the sense of the production context and performance of some of this stuff.
Sarah, would you like to start?
Well, to me, just one thing comes to mind about kin. I think someone said that very often it's not the child who performs, but the grandchild. But I think in my experience, it's always within the family, the child does. For example, we saw a picture of Abdul Saada, the singer from Syria who performed in Baghdad. His daughter Iman in Israel has become very famous, though of course she was not allowed to sing. Her father wouldn't want her to sing, her husband didn't want her to sing, her mother didn't want her to sing, but with tragedies in the family, she found that was her only way to express herself. So I have found, generally speaking, that where it's in the family, the children do carry on with it.
I mean, as a follow-up on...
No, I was pointed. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Sami.
Actually, you're absolutely right. I forgot.
Just very quickly, it's an excellent, if I may, just a very quickly, excellent point about embodied memory. I think for a lot of people who are second and third generation Iraqis, there's this feeling of having received a kind of embodied memory, but refracted, through, couched from memory and refracted across generations. So it's this kind of transgenerational displacement that Yaron was talking about in film also. And it often this is something that's a legacy of specific, something that you've experienced growing up and living with that kind of strange feeling of displacement, so embodiment, and in particularly within close familial relations and groups is very much tied to it. Also, I'll leave it there. Yeah, even among women that aren't necessarily kin, a lot of people have talked about what I heard in my work referred to as akhbirida or something. It's like the breastfeeding relationship. So these kind of very close relationships that form, a lot of it has to do with intimacy and vulnerability and these kinds of cultural loss and pain being able to be shared among particularly close family situations, yeah.
In the case of Salah and Daoud al-Kuwaiti, they were very lucky because their family encouraged them. They actually got their first instruments, the oud and the violin, from their uncle, who brought them these as gifts from India when he came back from a business trip. And their father allowed them to have lessons with Khaled al-Bakir. This was not very common. Many parents actually try to prevent their children from becoming musicians, especially professional musicians. Sometimes it was accepted if you only played for pleasure among friends, as long as you had another profession. You did not make a living as a musician. And Ali Jihad Rassi, in his book about tarab, music, discusses this, how often in the biography of a great singer, a mutrib, there is the story of how he or she had to overcome great difficulties from their families against them becoming musicians. And so there was this stigma, and I will just mention, to finish with, that Salah and Daoud al-Kuwaiti did not want their children to become musicians. We can hear about it here from a first-hand experience. The question is whether it was because of the harsh conditions in Israel or whether there were other reasons, but that's a different story.
Yes. Perhaps as a follow-up to Gadi's question, I would like to turn the attention from memory or post-memory and nostalgia to revival. And as you know, there is actually an active band called the Kuwaitis, relying, among others, on the kinship logic, right? Dudu Tasa and its relation to the Kuwaitis, but not always. In some cases, like with the Ziv Yehezkel, it's kind of a rediscovery, almost out of the blue, of a hidden heritage. And my question is whether you can trace effective rearticulations of these traditions that can take hold and create a re-engagement with these pasts, or is it just stories of lost traditions?
Thank you. Anybody would like to respond, or maybe Yaron? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would. Yeah.
Okay.
Along these lines, at least I see not only emerging, like popping out Facebook groups dealing with Arabic culture, but I think a genuine interest among Israelis, for example, second, third, Ashkenazi, non-Arabic speaking, to reconnect through culture.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's exactly the point I made toward the end of my talk, that if we look at films, let's say, for various reasons, I mean, I think it's really important to look at the period from roughly 1991 to the present. If you look at films that were made until the last, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years ago, it's really kind of the most dominant thing. I mean, I cannot speak about music, but I will say one thing about Zivia Hezkel. The most dominant thing is what I said, salvage cinema. So loss, finality, these words, as I said, death, end, that come time and again in these films. I will not go on with that, but it's extremely common, definitely when it comes to the experience of Iraqi Jews, second generation Iraqi Jews. Why? Because for Moroccan Jews, you cannot talk about finality when you could already, you know, in the 90s, 80s, whatever, go back to Morocco. For Iraq, it's a different story from their standpoint as Israelis. But it is, and I agree, and that's what I was trying to make, even in Dukidro, which, once again, as you know, Linda, I've known him for many, many years. I mean, I do see this shift. I mean, from this kind of discourse of end, past, to actually make the connection, like in the film that Linda participates and main figure there in Shadow in Baghdad. So I think what you're saying is absolutely right, and we see it. Just a comment, you mentioned Zivia Hezkel. Somebody just interviewed him a month ago, and he apparently is stopping this kind of music. He's not interested in that anymore. Very strange.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just add, that in terms of revival, there seems to be kind of a flourishing moment of cinema. There's definitely a lot of music groups, like including Dudu Tassa, who engages with the old recordings of the Al-Kuwaitis, and it's, you know, in Iraq and roll, they talk a lot about that. But La Falfula Groove is another band. A lot of it has to do with coeval's social movements in Israel and a kind of the emergence of a more inclusive kind of Zionism that allows for multiculturalism and the sort of, you know, uncovering of roots. It's, you know, looking for roots is a very, you know, strong sort of social drive right now, particularly among younger generations. And then also culinary nostalgia and literary forms, memories of Eden. There's a lot of nostalgicizing of the past in terms of a paradise and that sort of thing.
And if I may just one word about, I'm sorry.
Yeah, because Dafna.
No, you go, I'm sorry.
You mentioned La Falfula Groove. It's a band by the great-grandson of Youssef Zarour, whom you saw here, the Qanun player. And it's not only in the Iraqi sphere, it's also Neta El Kayam, the Israeli singer of Moroccan heritage, and Maureen Nehedar, the Israeli singer of Iranian heritage. And also here in the UK, I think here in the room, we have members of a band that also creates music following the Jewish Iraqi heritage. And it's a question whether this is a revival, whether this is a continuation and evolution of the tradition, because these are always, all these cases present the music in a new way. You can say that it's being translated into modern listeners. Modern, I mean current listeners.
Okay, so we don't have a lot of time, so Sami and then Amal, do you want to?
One
Okay,
second.
go ahead.
I also want to add, really, for me, the question in looking at these things, it's not whether there is attempt to connect to the past, it's how is it done. Ella Shohat wrote extensively about Boreka cinema. I wrote about Boreka cinema. You can say this is a form of supposedly connecting. The question is really more questions of appropriation and so on and so forth. I don't need to go into all of them.
Right.
Well, first I add my voice to the chorus of praise for the wonderful presentations that we had. I have a number of questions. I think for Sara, the question of the music among women, there is, of course, big tradition of all women gatherings having their own music. So in fact, in Iraq, it was al-Qabul.
Yes.
Kabul, it was a kind of at home for every woman would organize, all her women friends will come there and there'd be food and there'd often also be music, and sometimes they would hire professional musicians or singers. The other one was al-Hammam. That is much older, of course, the parties of women in the Hammam, and especially on special occasions like, before weddings and so on. There was always musical entertainment, other than singing, and also engaging professional female singers. The other point I want to make is, about origins of Iraqi songs and more generally Arab. One important source was Sufi, Muslim Sufi chants and songs in praise of the Prophet and the devotional. And in the case of Iraq, there was a particular figure of Mullah Uthman al-Mosuli, the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, a kind of Ottoman religious figure who came from Mosul, and for whom many of the rhythms, many of the forms of the songs are attributed, a kind of secularizing old religious songs, including, of course, the very popular Fog al-Nakhal Fog, and also Zuruni bis-Sana Marra. Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Anybody would like
I
to?
suppose what you said about the Qabul, it brings to mind the Aziz Ali song, Allah Yajazi Niswan. Yes.
دبر شقول غير تقوم تدق لي طبول وتقول لي هذا الأصول أنت كل النسوان.
Very good. Amal? Yeah.
So thank you so much about the very wonderful presentation. And regarding the author of the songs, Al-Ab, the father, Anastas al-Karmali, he published, his manuscript gathering the whole, he said, Muslims, women stories, the oral history of Baghdad, which is, this book was analyzed and edited and published in 80s in Iraq, in Baghdad. And I was really surprised when I saw most of the lyric, which he put it at the end of the books, originally of the Iraqi tradition, and even Fairuz bint al-Sharabiya Ayuna Lawziya. So in this book, which is written in 1916, it is an Baghdadi Iraqi oral poetry. This is one thing. So if you want to know the author, not the author, the origin of those songs, you can return back to this book, which is, I think, over 1,000 pages. I have this book. Second, for the great project, which is recently I recognized it by Qatar Foundation in collaboration with the British Library, they documented all the Iraqi music, and you can find it for free in SoundCloud, which is, I was by accident, I know that. So third point I want to reflect, which is I have a mixed feeling about the events of 1991. So I belong to a generation, the 80s poetry generation, which I witnessed this war. I was in Baghdad, and as here is mentioned in the film, very painful sentence that the American, they will teach a lesson for Iraqis, which is it was a hard lessons, and I myself, my neighbors, my brothers, everyone lost in this war. And from American and British accounts, till now, 45 mass graves didn't, I mean, the American didn't even give information about those mass graves, and 7,000 Iraqi soldiers were buried in the Sahara, I mean, in the desert. So, and this sentence completely contradict, forget Baghdad. In 2003, 19th of March, it was hours before Bush bombing Baghdad. I was in the cinema in Berlin. I was in my German exile. So I took my little girls. I went with Auni Karoumi's family. They are Christian Iraqi from Mosul, and we went to the cinema, and it was the first screening for this film. And for me, I grow up with that Jews, they are Zionists, and Israel, and it's our enemy. So the first time I saw Iraqis, I heard people, they are speaking Maslawi for me. Of course, I didn't know that this is also the dialect of the Jew. And Sami Mikhail, when he mentioned in the film, and also Samir Naqash, but Sami Mikhail about 1991, he mentioned this sentence, which is completely different approach from the American. They will teach them a lesson. He said, after the bombing, Israel by Saddam, the missiles, he said, I was invited to an interview in Israeli TV, and he said this sentence, which was really has an impact on me, on millions of Iraqis who watch this film. And he said, instead of the moderator, he expecting me to talk against the attack. And he said, look, I was very sad about the bombing of Jisr al-Mu'allaq, the hanging bridge, because this Mu'allaq for me, it's my memory, the first love, the first kiss in my life was there. So sorry for I am so emotional, and this film has really changed my life, and it was a turning point in my life that I have really, and people like me, and they suffered, and because this narrative is completely is not there, in Iraq during Saddam times, the Ba'ath Party, and unfortunately after removing the regime, which all of us, we hoped that we will have an inclusive, a democratic Iraq that recognizes this history. And we witness now a complete erasure of this history in Iraq, and in a different levels. Thank you, and so sorry for.
Thank you. I'm being told that we're out of time. I'm very sorry. So, no, I'm being given,